The galactic shockwave. The Grand Senate Hall was never silent. It was a place of debate, of power struggles, of voices rising and falling in endless discussions about the fate of the Empire. But today was different. Today the hall was frozen in absolute silence. Every senator, every royal advisor, and every noble present stared at the holographic image flickering in the air. The message had arrived only moments ago, yet its impact was already shaking the very foundation of the Empire. At the center of the room, standing on the high platform, was the Supreme Chancellor of the Senate, an aged Xorvian with 4 golden eyes that now burned with disbelief. His deep voice, usually filled with authority, wavered slightly as he repeated the words written in the message. A human has fathered children with the Star Emperor's daughters. Gasps echoed through the hall. Some senators stood from their seats, their scaled and furred faces twisted in shock. Others whispered furiously to each other, trying to make sense of the impossible news. "It must be a mistake," shouted a senator from the Icarian system, her long, serpent-like body coiling in frustration. "No human would dare." "Yet the proof is undeniable," another senator murmured, staring at the image. The holographic projection displayed a human male, tall, strong, with short brown hair and sharp blue eyes. He stood beside 2 alien women, their features strange and unlike any traditional beauty in the Empire. They were the daughters of the mighty Star Emperor, feared and ridiculed by all. Their skin was a deep, shimmering purple, their eyes large and bright, their limbs longer than normal humanoids. Their features were considered monstrous by the Empire's standards. And yet, the human stood with them. Not as a prisoner, not as a victim, but as a partner, a father to their children. "This is madness," growled a thick-bodied reptilian senator. "Why would a human do this? What could he possibly gain?" A deep, rumbling voice silenced the room. "The only way to find out," the Supreme Chancellor said, "is to ask him ourselves." All eyes turned to the great doors at the back of the hall. The guards, their silver armor gleaming under the bright Senate lights, marched forward. Between them, shackled in heavy restraints, was the man from the hologram, the human, Captain James Carter. His posture was straight despite the weight of the chains. His blue eyes held no fear as he was led to the center of the hall. He had faced war, traveled through unknown galaxies, and survived battles against terrifying alien creatures. Standing before a room full of self-important senators did not shake him. The Supreme Chancellor stepped forward, towering over James. "You are accused of breaking the ancient laws of the Empire," he declared. "You have defiled the royal bloodline and brought disgrace upon the Star Emperor himself." James smirked. "Disgrace," he repeated, tilting his head slightly. "Last I checked, love wasn't a crime." The room exploded into noise. Some senators shouted in fury, others laughed in disbelief. The Supreme Chancellor slammed his staff against the floor, demanding silence. "You expect us to believe this was love?" the Chancellor asked. "That you, a mere human, chose to be with the Emperor's daughters?" James' smile didn't fade. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the powerful beings surrounding him. They all saw the same thing, a human who refused to bow, a human who carried himself like an equal, not a lesser creature. "I chose them," James said simply, "because I saw something none of you ever did." The silence was heavier this time. Even the Supreme Chancellor hesitated. James continued, his voice steady. "You look at them and see something ugly, something unworthy. But I saw kindness. I saw strength. I saw souls, not just appearances. And unlike you all, I saw their pain." Some senators shifted uncomfortably. Others sneered. "You speak as if they were victims," a senator scoffed. "They are royal. They are powerful." James narrowed his eyes. "And yet you kept them locked away, treated them like a shameful secret. No one looked at them. No one spoke of them. No one even considered them part of the Empire. And when I did, you call it a crime." The Supreme Chancellor clenched his jaw. "You are a fool, human. Do you understand the chaos you have caused?" James shrugged. "Maybe I do. Maybe I don't." He smirked again. "But what I do know is that the Emperor hasn't executed me yet, and that means he's curious." A new kind of tension filled the room. Because James was right. The Star Emperor was known for his swift and brutal punishments. If James had truly committed an unforgivable crime, he would already be dead. Before anyone could say another word, a loud beep echoed through the hall. The Supreme Chancellor turned as a new hologram flickered to life. A dark figure appeared, the Star Emperor himself. His golden eyes burned like twin suns, his massive form cloaked in regal robes of deep crimson. His voice, deep as a collapsing star, rumbled through the chamber. "Bring the human to me." The Senate was stunned into silence once again. James Carter simply grinned. "Well," he muttered to himself, "this should be interesting." The secret agreement. The Senate hall faded behind him as Captain James Carter was escorted through the gleaming corridors of the Imperial Palace. His hands were still bound, but he walked tall, his eyes scanning the towering structures, the polished floors, the banners displaying the Emperor's title, a golden eye wreathed in fire. This was not his first time in the palace. He had been here before, long before the scandal that now gripped the galaxy. But back then, he had arrived as a guest, a mere human diplomat sent to establish trade talks between Earth and the Star Empire. No one had paid him much attention. Humans were a relatively new species in the galactic order, seen as weak, insignificant. But everything changed the night he met Rin Zera. James' thoughts drifted back to that night, when his life took a path no one could have predicted. 1 year ago, the first encounter. The palace gardens were vast, filled with exotic plants from 1,000 worlds. The air was thick with the scent of alien flowers, their petals glowing softly under the twin moons. James had wandered there alone, away from the stiff diplomatic meetings, the endless discussions about alliances and treaties. He had no idea he was being watched. A soft rustling made him turn. At first, he thought it was a shadow. A tall, slender figure stood behind the flowering trees, half hidden in the moonlight. When she stepped forward, James felt his breath catch. Her deep violet skin shimmered under the night sky. Her eyes, large and golden, reflected the light like polished metal. Her limbs were long and graceful, her face angular, alien. She was unlike any being he had ever seen, and yet there was something captivating about her presence. "You are the human," she said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. James raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" She hesitated before speaking. "Rin Zera, daughter of the Emperor." James was stunned. He had heard of the Emperor's daughters, but they were never seen in public. The rumors about them were cruel, stories of their monstrous forms, their cursed lineage. But standing before him was no monster. "Did you follow me?" he asked, half smirking. Rin Zera's lips twitched, almost a smile. "No one ever comes here," she said. "Except me." James crossed his arms, studying her. "Why?" She hesitated again, then lifted her chin. "Because in the palace, I am nothing. Out here, at least I am alone." Her words carried a weight that James recognized. The weight of isolation. He had felt it himself, more times than he cared to admit. But why would the Emperor's daughter feel the same? James exhaled, looking up at the sky. "Well, I guess that makes two of us." She blinked, as if surprised by his answer. For a moment, neither of them spoke. And then, in the quiet of the night, something unspoken passed between them. A connection. That was the first night they talked. The secret agreement. Now, walking through the Emperor's palace as a prisoner instead of a guest, James couldn't help but smile to himself. He had made his choice a long time ago. The guards led him through towering doors into the Emperor's throne room, a chamber so massive, it made him feel like an insect standing before a god. Pillars of black stone stretched to the ceiling. Banners of deep red hung like flowing rivers of blood. And at the end of the great hall sat the Star Emperor himself. Golden-skinned, clad in robes woven with celestial silk, his eyes burned with power. But James saw something else behind that fire: curiosity. "You claim to love my daughters," the Emperor rumbled. "You claim to have chosen them. But I know the truth." James raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" The Emperor leaned forward, his golden gaze piercing. "You sought something. You knew of the prophecy." James remained silent. He had expected this. The Emperor was no fool. He knew the ancient legend that haunted his bloodline. A heart untainted by fear will bring balance to the empire. It was an old prophecy, whispered in secret halls, dismissed by many as myth. But for Rinzera and her sister Vayrina, it had never been just a story. It was their only hope. James exhaled slowly. "I didn't seek them out because of some prophecy," he said. "I sought them out because they deserved better than the prison you kept them in." A heavy silence filled the throne room. The Emperor's fingers tightened on the armrest of his throne. The guards tensed. But James didn't look away. Finally, the Emperor let out a slow breath. "You are either a fool or a warrior," he said. "Perhaps both." James smirked. "I get that a lot." The Emperor studied him for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted to the two figures standing behind the pillars. Rinzera and Vayrina stepped forward. The Senate had called them ugly, monstrous. But to James, they were fierce, beautiful in their own way. They had fought against a lifetime of rejection, of being hidden in the shadows. And now, they stood tall, unashamed. "You still do not understand the chaos you have unleashed," the Emperor said. "The Senate will never accept this. The noble houses will call for your execution. There are those who would kill your children before they ever take their first breath." James' expression hardened. He had known this wouldn't be easy. He had known that defying the Empire's traditions would make him a target. But he wasn't afraid. "Let them try," he said. "They'll find that humans don't break so easily." The Emperor's lips curled into something close to amusement. "You remind me of the first humans I met," he said. "Foolish, reckless, but strong." A long pause followed. Then the Emperor rose from his throne, his golden eyes locked onto James. "You have made your choice, human," he said. "Now you must face the consequences." James held his gaze. "I've been facing them since the day I met Rinzera." The Emperor turned to his daughters. "You have chosen your path as well," he said. "Do you understand what this means?" Rinzera nodded. "We do, Father." The Emperor closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then he opened them and spoke the words that would change the fate of the Empire. Then so be it. Outside, the galaxy was already burning with the news. The Emperor's daughters had chosen a human, and the Empire would never be the same again. The betrayal within. The halls of the Imperial Palace were never quiet. Even in the dead of night, the shadows whispered, and unseen figures moved with purpose. But tonight, the air was different, thick with tension, electric with the weight of what had just transpired. Captain James Carter stood near the balcony of his private chamber, staring at the twin moons of the Star Empire. Behind him, Rinzera and Vayrina moved in silence, their long, graceful forms partially hidden in the dim light. Their expressions were unreadable, but James could feel their unease. The Emperor made his decision. James said finally, his voice low. "But that doesn't mean everyone will accept it." Rinzera stepped beside him, her golden eyes reflecting the moon's glow. "They will come for us," she murmured. "For our children." James exhaled sharply. He had spent his life as a soldier, navigating war zones, negotiating with alien species, and making impossible choices. But this was something different. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for his family. "We knew this would happen," Vayrina added, standing behind them. "The noble houses will not let a human's blood mix with the royal lineage without resistance." James turned to them, his gaze steady. "Then we make sure they fail." But even as he said the words, he knew the real danger wasn't just from the noble houses. It wasn't from the Senate, or the distant factions plotting in the shadows. The real threat was already inside the palace, a conspiracy in the dark. Deep within the palace walls, far from the emperor's throne room, a secret meeting was taking place. A long, dark table stretched across the center of the chamber, surrounded by shadowed figures. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, the flickering torchlight casting strange shapes on the walls. At the head of the table sat Lord Vrakis, one of the emperor's oldest advisors. His scaled skin was rough with age, his sharp eyes filled with quiet fury. "This cannot stand," he said, his voice a cold whisper. "The emperor has made a mistake. A human cannot be allowed to taint the royal bloodline." Across from him, Senator Tuvos, a feline-like noble with gleaming silver fur, narrowed her slitted eyes. "And yet, the emperor has spoken," she said. "Defying him openly would be suicide." Vrakis' lips curled into a thin smile. Who said anything about defying him openly? The room fell silent. Vrakis leaned forward. "There is a way to end this without turning the empire against itself. The human must be removed, quietly, efficiently. And once he is gone, the emperor's daughters will have no choice but to renounce their claim." Another senator, an amphibian-like being with deep blue skin, scoffed. "And you think the emperor will not suspect?" Vrakis' smile widened. "Of course he will. But suspicion is not proof. And without proof, even an emperor is bound by his own laws." The room remained quiet for a moment. Then, one by one, the figures nodded. The decision had been made. Captain James Carter had to die. The first attack. James was still awake when the attack came. He had spent too many years in battle to ignore the subtle shifts in the air, the almost imperceptible movements beyond the walls. His instincts screamed at him just moments before the first blade struck. A dark figure lunged from the shadows, a curved dagger gleaming in the moonlight. James twisted, barely avoiding the fatal strike. He grabbed the assassin's wrist, forcing the blade away as they struggled. The figure was fast, but James had fought faster enemies before. With a sharp twist, he slammed the assassin against the stone wall. The second attacker was already moving. Rinzera and Vayrina reacted instantly. The youngest sister, Vayrina, moved with deadly precision, her long limbs striking out like a whip. She grabbed the assassin's arm mid-strike and wrenched it backward with terrifying strength. The sickening snap of bone echoed through the chamber. Rinzera, calmer but no less deadly, extended her claws and sliced through the air, slashing across the third attacker's chest. The assassin fell, gasping. James kicked the first attacker away and grabbed the fallen dagger. He held it up, examining the hilt. A symbol was etched into the metal, a familiar emblem, a mark of the Pureborn Order. His stomach twisted. He had heard of them before. A radical faction that believed in the superiority of the Empire's original bloodlines. They despised outsiders, and they would rather see the Empire burn than accept a human into the royal lineage. James' gaze darkened. "We need to get to the Emperor." Rinzera nodded, wiping the blood from her claws. "He needs to know that the war has already begun." The Emperor's dilemma. The Emperor was already waiting when they arrived. The throne room was nearly empty, save for a handful of royal guards and his most trusted advisors. His golden eyes flickered over James and his daughters, taking in the bloodstains on their clothing. "You were attacked," he said. It was not a question. James nodded. He tossed the assassin's dagger onto the floor before the Emperor's feet. The Pureborn Order. The Emperor's expression didn't change, but James could see the tension in his jaw. "They have been silent for decades," the Emperor murmured. "I had thought them gone." "Well, they're back," James said. "And they want me dead." The room was heavy with silence. Then the Emperor did something unexpected. He laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound, full of both amusement and something else, something dangerous. "Of course they do," he said. "You have done what no one else ever dared, human. You have shaken the foundations of the Empire itself." James narrowed his eyes. "You don't seem particularly concerned." The Emperor's gaze locked onto him. "Because you are still standing." James tilted his head. "And if I weren't?" The Emperor leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Then you would not have been worthy of my daughters." James stared at him for a long moment. Then he grinned. The Emperor's lips curled slightly in return. But the moment was short-lived. A royal guard rushed into the room, his face pale. "My Emperor," he gasped, "there has been an explosion in the Senate hall." Everyone tensed. The Emperor stood slowly, his golden eyes burning with fury. "Then it has begun," he said. James clenched his fists. He had known the war for his family's future would come. He just hadn't expected it to start tonight. Assassins in the dark. The explosion in the Senate hall was just the beginning. As flames consumed the heart of the Empire's political chamber, chaos erupted across the city. The sky was streaked with the glow of emergency beacons, and the streets filled with panicked citizens. But inside the Imperial Palace, a different kind of war was about to begin. James Carter stood in the dimly lit corridor outside his quarters, his muscles tense as he listened to the eerie silence. The Pureborn Order had made their move. The attack in the Senate was a distraction. He was sure of it. They wanted to divide the Emperor's focus, weaken his defenses, which meant the real threat was here. "Stay close," James muttered, gripping the dagger he had taken from the last assassin. Rin Zera and Vayrina nodded, their golden eyes scanning the shadows. They were daughters of the Star Emperor, trained in combat, but even they knew this night would test them in ways they had never faced before. Then the lights flickered. A rush of cold air swept through the corridor, and the first blade struck. The battle in the shadows. James ducked just in time as a curved dagger slashed through the air, where his throat had been moments before. The assassin melted back into the darkness, their cloak blending with the flickering shadows. No sound, no scent, nothing but the glint of steel before the next attack came. But James was ready. He sidestepped, catching his attacker's wrist mid-strike, twisting it with brutal efficiency. The assassin let out a choked gasp before Rin Zera's clawed fingers raked across their chest. The assassin crumpled, but two more figures emerged from the darkness, their blades flashing. Vayrina moved first. She twisted into a low stance, her long limbs striking out with precision. Her claws caught the second assassin's throat before they could react. A sharp, wet gurgle filled the air as the body collapsed to the floor. James turned in time to block a strike aimed at Rin Zera. He wasn't as fast as these assassins. Few humans were, but he was unpredictable. He used angles they didn't expect, struck from directions they couldn't counter. He feinted left, then drove his dagger into the third assassin's ribs. For a second, silence returned. Then, from the shadows beyond the corridor, more footsteps approached. "They're testing us," Rin Zera hissed. "Then let's fail them," James growled, shifting into a ready stance. The next wave of assassins came like ghosts, silent and deadly. But James and the Emperor's daughters were no easy prey. Steel clashed against claws, daggers met fists, and for the first time in the history of the Empire, a human fought alongside the royal bloodline. The hidden betrayal. By the time the last assassin fell, the corridor was painted in dark blood. James wiped the sweat from his forehead, breathing heavily. His arms ached, his knuckles were bruised, but he was still standing. Vayrina leaned against the wall, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Rin Zera pressed a hand to a wound on her shoulder, but her eyes burned with fierce determination. "They won't stop," she said. "Not until one of us is dead." James nodded. "Then let's find out who sent them." He crouched beside one of the fallen assassins, yanking off their hood. The face beneath was reptilian, scared, with silver markings along the temples, a sign of nobility. James' stomach twisted. This wasn't just an attack. This was a message. The Pureborn weren't just using mercenaries. Someone inside the Emperor's own court had given the order. A cold realization settled over him. We have a traitor. Rinzera's jaw tightened. Then we need to tell my father. Now. The Emperor's decision. The throne room was nearly empty when they arrived. Only the Emperor and his most trusted guards remained, but even they stiffened at the sight of James and the daughters, bloody but alive. The Emperor's golden eyes locked onto them. I see the assassins failed. James tossed the bloody dagger onto the floor before the throne. They weren't just assassins, he said. They were your own nobles. The room went still. The Emperor's expression didn't change, but James could see it, the flicker of something dangerous behind his gaze. He had ruled for centuries. He had seen betrayal before. But this was different. Rinzera stepped forward. Father, the Pureborn are no longer hiding in the shadows. They have infiltrated the highest ranks of the Empire. The Emperor exhaled slowly. And you have proof. James gestured toward the dagger. This belonged to a noble, someone high-ranking enough to fund a private army. The Emperor stared at the weapon for a long moment. Then he looked at James. You have brought chaos to my empire, human. James met his gaze without flinching. Maybe. But I also brought the truth. The Emperor's lips curled slightly. You truly believe you can change a system that has existed for thousands of years? James smirked. I don't believe it. I know it. A deep chuckle rumbled from the Emperor's chest. Then you may live long enough to see if you are right. He turned to his guards. Seal the palace. No one leaves without my command. His voice hardened. Find the traitors. Bring me their heads. James felt a slow grin spread across his face. The war had truly begun. The final warning. As James and the Emperor's daughters left the throne room, Rinzera walked beside him in silence. Finally, she spoke. You have no idea what you've started, do you? James exhaled. I started nothing. The corruption was already there. I just kicked the door open. Vayrina smirked. You kicked the whole palace down. James chuckled, but his eyes remained sharp. The Pureborn had made their move. Now it was his turn. And if they thought a human was going to roll over and die, they were about to learn a very painful lesson. The Emperor's dilemma. The imperial palace had become a fortress. The great halls, once filled with courtiers and advisors, now echoed with the heavy boots of royal guards patrolling every entrance. The Senate district was in ruins from the explosion, and the city below was in turmoil. Fear gripped the noble houses. Some had already fled off-world, while others were sharpening their knives in the shadows. James Carter stood in the Emperor's private chamber, his arms crossed as he watched the old ruler pace. The Star Emperor, the most powerful man in the galaxy, had never looked more burdened. You understand what you have done, human? The Emperor said at last, his golden eyes narrowing. James smirked. Yeah, I kicked a hornet's nest, but that nest was already rotting from the inside. The Emperor exhaled sharply, his massive hands resting on the table before him. The Senate is demanding justice. The noble houses are in uproar. And now, assassins roam my palace like vermin. He turned, his gaze heavy. And all of this because of you. James didn't flinch. No, all of this because they couldn't handle the truth. Silence stretched between them. James knew the truth the Emperor didn't want to admit. This wasn't about him. The Pureborn Order had been planning their coup long before James ever entered the picture. His presence had only accelerated their plans. The Empire wasn't falling apart because of a human fathering children with the Emperor's daughters. It was falling apart because it had been rotting for years. Rinzera and Vayrina stood beside James, silent but watchful. Their father's gaze flickered to them. You have chosen him, the Emperor murmured, despite everything. Rinzera nodded. Because he chose us first. A strange emotion flickered in the emperor's gaze. Regret? Pride? James couldn't tell. You've always feared what would happen if we stood in the light, Vayrina added, her voice softer. But now, the whole galaxy is watching, and we are no longer shadows. The emperor exhaled slowly, sitting back in his chair. Then I have no choice. James raised an eyebrow. Meaning? The emperor straightened, his expression unreadable. If I stand by your side, I will make enemies of half the empire. The noble houses will revolt. The Senate will refuse my commands. War will be inevitable. James studied him. And if you stand against us, the emperor's expression didn't change. Then I will lose my daughters. Another heavy silence. James leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. Then the choice is simple. You fight. The emperor gave a humorless chuckle. Do you think it is that easy? James' gaze didn't waver. No, but it's the only way forward. The Senate's decision. Hours later, the Grand Senate Hall stood in ruins, the air thick with smoke and tension. But despite the damage, the surviving senators had gathered. The emperor sat on his throne, his daughters on either side, and James standing just behind them, his presence an unspoken challenge to the old ways. Lord Vrakis, the leader of the opposition, stepped forward, his cold reptilian eyes locked onto the emperor. This cannot continue, he declared. This human has insulted our laws, defiled our traditions. And now, our empire burns because of him. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some nodded in agreement. Others remained silent. James let out a slow breath, keeping his expression unreadable. He wasn't surprised by Vrakis' words. The man had been waiting for this moment, using the chaos to push his own agenda. The emperor's fingers tightened on the armrest of his throne. You blamed the human, yet it was your assassins who attempted to murder my daughters. Vrakis didn't even flinch. Your Highness, I do not deny that factions within our empire have taken extreme measures, but that is only proof of how dangerous this situation has become. He turned to the rest of the Senate. A human in the royal bloodline threatens the very foundation of our rule. If we allow this, what will stop others from following? What will stop our traditions from being torn apart? James could feel the weight of the room shifting. Fear was a powerful weapon. Before the murmurs could grow louder, he stepped forward. You keep saying I've defiled your traditions, James said, his voice calm but firm. But let's be real. This isn't about me. It's about power. Vrakis turned sharply. You don't care about traditions, James interrupted. You care about control. You've kept Rinzera and Vayrina hidden because you were afraid of them, afraid that they would change things, that they would challenge the system you built. He looked around the room, meeting the gazes of the other senators. I don't expect you to accept me. Hell, I don't care if you hate me. But ask yourselves this, if your system is so strong, why is it falling apart the second someone questions it? The silence that followed was deafening. The emperor watched the room carefully. He saw the shift, the hesitation, the doubt creeping into the minds of those who had been so certain before. Then he rose to his feet. The empire has always been built on strength, he said, his voice carrying through the chamber. And the greatest strength is not in blood, but in unity. He turned his golden gaze to Vrakis. I will not deny my daughters, nor will I deny my grandchildren. If you wish to challenge that, you may do so with a blade in your hand. A challenge, a clear, undeniable declaration. The Senate erupted in chaos. Some stood, shouting in outrage. Others hesitated, uncertain. But Vrakis? He said nothing. Because he knew the truth. If he challenged the emperor, he would not win. And so, he bowed stiffly. As you command, your majesty. But James saw the hatred in his eyes. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The emperor's warning. Later that night, James stood on the palace balcony. The city burning below. He wasn't naive. Today had been a victory, but the real battle was still ahead. The Emperor stepped beside him, his gaze unreadable. "You have forced my hand, human," he murmured. James didn't look away. "And?" The Emperor chuckled. "And now we will see if you are truly worthy of standing at my side." James smirked. "Wouldn't have it any other way." The Emperor exhaled, his gaze shifting to the stars. "War is coming. Be ready." James looked out at the horizon. He was always ready. The coup begins. The air inside the imperial palace had changed. It was thick with something unseen but undeniable, a weight pressing down on every corridor, every chamber, every shadowed corner. The pure-born order had failed in their assassinations, but that only meant one thing. They would strike again. And this time, they wouldn't hide in the dark. James Carter stood in the Emperor's private war chamber, surrounded by towering figures of power, royal generals, high-ranking senators, and the Emperor himself. The walls were lined with holographic maps of the Empire, displaying a growing list of insurgencies, disappearances, and betrayals. The pure-born order had begun moving openly. "This is worse than we expected," General Varn muttered, his scaled fingers tracing a rising insurgency report. "Entire planets are refusing to acknowledge your ruling, Your Majesty. Some are even swearing loyalty to Vrakis and his faction." James crossed his arms. He wasn't surprised. The Senate had bowed in public, but Vrakis and his allies had never accepted defeat. Now, they were making their final move. The Emperor remained silent, his golden eyes scanning the reports with the quiet intensity of a predator. Finally, he spoke. "They are not trying to destroy me," he murmured. "They are trying to replace me." James raised an eyebrow. "So they think they can just walk in and take the throne?" Vayrina scoffed. "No, they will force my father to step down." Rin-Zara nodded. "The noble houses hold much influence, even outside this palace. If enough of them unite, the military will be split. And if the military fractures, the empire will collapse into civil war." James exhaled slowly. They weren't just fighting an assassination attempt anymore. They were fighting for the very survival of the empire itself. The Emperor turned to his war council. "The Pureborn cannot be reasoned with. They will not stop until they control the throne." His gaze flickered toward James. "Which means we must move first." James' lips curled into a smirk. "Then let's hit them before they know what's coming." A message in blood. The first attack came before they could strike. It was midnight when the palace alarms roared to life. The heavy hum of energy shields crackled through the corridors as soldiers scrambled to their positions. James was already awake when it happened. His instincts had been screaming at him all night. By the time he and the Emperor's daughters reached the war room, the reports were flooding in. "They're inside the palace," a guard shouted. Vrakis forces breached the western gates. James tightened his grip on his stolen dagger. The coup had begun. A hologram flickered to life in the center of the room. The image of Lord Vrakis appeared, his reptilian face calm, his slitted eyes gleaming with cold amusement. "It is time for the old ways to end," he said smoothly. "You have ruled for too long, Emperor. The noble houses have spoken. Stand down, and we will allow you to leave with your life." The Emperor didn't even blink. "I do not negotiate with traitors." Vrakis smiled, as if he had expected that answer. "Then you will die with your empire." The transmission cut. James exhaled sharply. Well, that was dramatic. A moment later, the palace shook. Explosions ripped through the lower levels, the force of the blast sending tremors up through the floors. James grabbed the edge of a table to steady himself, cursing under his breath. "They're inside," Rin-Zara growled. James met the Emperor's gaze. "We need to move. Now." The Emperor didn't hesitate. He turned to his guards. "Secure the royal vaults. Ensure my daughters and the human make it to the command center." James stiffened. "Whoa, hold up. You're not coming with us." The Emperor's golden gaze was unreadable. "My place is here." James clenched his jaw. He knew the look in the Emperor's eyes, the look of a man ready to make his last stand. But he wasn't about to let that happen. Like hell it is, James growled. Renzera stepped forward. Father, if you stay, they will kill you. The Emperor exhaled slowly. Then I will die standing. James shook his head. No, no way in hell. We fight together, he said firmly. You want this empire to survive. Then stop acting like a martyr and start acting like a ruler. Silence. Then something strange happened. The Emperor smiled. A bold human, indeed, he murmured. Then he turned to his guards. Prepare for war. The throne room siege. The pure-born forces poured into the palace like a flood. Armored mercenaries, rogue royal guards, and pure-born fanatics stormed the halls, their weapons blazing. The once majestic corridors became a battlefield, littered with the bodies of fallen warriors. James fought like hell. He ducked under a plasma bolt, rolling into a close strike. His dagger found its mark, and an enemy soldier collapsed. He spun, blocking another attack, before slamming his fist into the side of a mercenary's helmet. Renzera and Vayrina were at his side, moving with deadly grace. Claws met steel, blades clashed against energy shields. And above it all, the Emperor stood like a war god, wielding a massive, crackling energy staff. With each strike, he sent enemies flying, his golden eyes burning with fury. The palace walls trembled as the fighting raged on. But then, the main gates burst open. Lord Vrakis stepped into the throne room, flanked by elite pure-born warriors. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. James wiped blood from his lip and grinned. Took you long enough. Vrakis didn't smile. It is over, human. You are outnumbered. Surrender, and I may spare your life. James glanced at the Emperor. The old ruler let out a low chuckle. You don't know humans very well, do you? The Emperor said. Vrakis frowned. What are you talking about? James smirked. We never surrender. And that's when the hidden explosives detonated. The last stand. The trap had been set long before the battle even started. James had made sure of it. The moment Vrakis and his elite warriors stepped into the throne room, the palace's hidden defense charges ignited. The explosion tore through the enemy ranks, sending bodies flying, throwing debris into the air. Vrakis stumbled backward, coughing through the smoke. His warriors lay in ruin, caught in the humans' carefully laid ambush. James stepped forward, his dagger gleaming. Game over. Vrakis snarled in rage. He lunged forward, his blade aiming for James' heart. But he never made it. The Emperor moved faster than lightning, his energy staff slicing through the air. The impact sent Vrakis crashing to the floor, gasping in pain. The old ruler loomed over him, his golden eyes burning with finality. You thought you could take my empire, the Emperor whispered. Vrakis coughed, blood trickling from his mouth. It is already broken. The Emperor didn't answer. He simply drove his staff through Vrakis' chest. The rebellion ended with a single strike. The aftermath. When the dust settled, the pure-born forces were crushed. The remaining traitors were rounded up, and the empire, though shaken, stood stronger than before. James sat on the steps of the throne, exhausted but victorious. The Emperor looked down at him. You saved my empire today, human. James smirked. Just another day at the office. The Emperor chuckled. And what will you do now? James looked at Renzera and Vayrina, his family, his future. He grinned. Stick around. Someone's got to make sure you don't screw this up again. The Emperor laughed. And the empire was reborn. The last stand, and a new beginning. The fires of battle had barely cooled, but the scars would last for generations. The imperial palace, once the grand heart of the Star Empire, now stood battered and bruised. Smoke still rose from the shattered western halls, and the scent of scorched stone and metal hung thick in the air. The rebellion had been crushed, its leaders slain or captured. The Pureborn Order was no more, but victory had come at a cost. James Carter stood at the highest balcony, looking down at the Capitol below. Streets once filled with celebration were now filled with whispers of change. The people had seen what the Senate tried to deny. The empire had already begun to evolve, whether they liked it or not. Behind him, the Star Emperor sat on his throne. He had ruled for centuries, unchallenged and absolute. But today, even he seemed smaller, weighed down by the battle that nearly took everything from him. "You have won," the Emperor said at last, his deep voice breaking the silence. "And now you must decide what comes next." James turned, crossing his arms. "Funny, I thought you were the Emperor. Isn't that your job?" The Emperor chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. An emperor only has power if his people follow him, and after what has happened today, the people are looking for something new. James exhaled slowly. He knew where this was going. Rinzera and Vayrina stepped forward, their golden eyes gleaming in the dim light. They had fought beside James, defied an empire, and now stood not as hidden outcasts, but as rightful heirs. For the first time, they were truly free. "The noble houses are fractured," Rinzera said. "The Senate is weak. The military is divided." Vayrina nodded. "The empire needs a leader strong enough to hold it together, someone the people will believe in." James frowned. "And you think that's me?" The Emperor's gaze didn't waver. "You have already reshaped the empire with your actions, human. You have done what I could not. You have forced them to see the truth. You have broken tradition, and yet you still stand." James let out a slow breath. "I didn't come here to take your throne, old man." The Emperor's lips curled slightly. "No, but fate rarely cares what we came for." Silence stretched between them. James knew what was being asked of him. He had been fighting to survive from the moment he set foot in this empire. Now, they wanted him to rule it. A human, in control of the greatest empire in the galaxy. It was insane. It was impossible. And yet, James looked at Rinzera and Vayrina. He thought of his unborn children, of the generations that would follow. If he walked away now, what would happen to them? He already knew the answer. The noble houses would wait. They would regroup. And one day, the next rebellion would rise, more dangerous than the last. Everything they fought for would be erased. No, he wasn't going to let that happen. James turned back to the Emperor, his expression unreadable. "If I do this, I do it my way." The Emperor raised an eyebrow. "And what is your way, human?" James smirked. "No more secrets. No more shadows. If this empire is going to survive, then we stop pretending it's perfect. We stop treating species like they're lesser. We stop letting traditions decide the future." He stepped forward, staring the Emperor down. "And if that means tearing apart everything that came before, then so be it." For a moment, the old ruler said nothing. Then slowly he smiled. "Then let it be so. The coronation of a human king." The announcement shook the galaxy. The news spread faster than light itself. A human was to rule beside the royal heirs, leading the Star Empire into a new age. Some called it madness, others called it treason. And yet, the people listened. For the first time in centuries, the empire was changing. The day of the coronation came faster than James would have liked. The throne room had been rebuilt, but not as it was before. The towering banners of the noble houses had been removed, replaced by a new symbol, one that represented not just the royal bloodline, but all people of the empire. The ceremony was simple, but the weight of it was immense. James stood before the gathered leaders, dressed in ceremonial armor that he found far too heavy. The Emperor, still seated on his throne, watched with sharp golden eyes. Rinzera and Vayrina stood at his sides, no longer hidden away, but recognized as the rightful heirs of the empire. As James took the ceremonial blade from the Emperor's hands, the weight of it settled against his palm. This was it. A human, once considered an outsider, was now one of them. James lifted the blade, driving it into the stone pillar before him, the ancient symbol of an unbroken legacy. The sound echoed through the chamber, sealing the moment in history. A ripple passed through the gathered crowd. Some whispered, others bowed their heads. And then the Emperor spoke the words that would be remembered for generations. From this day forward, humanity is one with the Empire. For a long time, no one moved. Then, one by one, the nobles and generals knelt, not just to the Emperor, but to James Carter, the first human king of the Star Empire, a future unknown. That night, James stood on the balcony of the palace, staring at the stars. The weight of the crown, both real and symbolic, pressed on his mind. He had never wanted power, but power had found him anyway. "You're thinking too much," Rin-Zera murmured, stepping beside him. Vayrina smirked. A king should learn to enjoy his victories. James chuckled softly. King. Emperor. Hell, I don't even know what to call myself. Rin-Zera's golden eyes gleamed. Then call yourself what you always have. James raised an eyebrow. And what's that? She smiled. Human. James exhaled, a slow grin spreading across his face. He turned his gaze back to the stars. Whatever came next, he would be ready, because humans had a way of surviving against all odds. And now, they had a throne to prove it.